Hello everybody, and I am back with a video. It's been such a long time since I've been able to do this, but I just couldn't resist with Halloween coming up, so I wanted to do a fun watercolor for you guys since that's what I've been working on lately. Turns out having a baby makes you super busy, so that's why it's been a little while. Hopefully you've seen me on Facebook and Instagram with the work I've been doing there. And these are the watercolors that I'll be using. I've tried out a couple different brands, but I still really like these. These are the Gansai Tombi watercolors. You can find them on Amazon. They are highly pigmented and really easy to work with, so especially as far as just buying a set of watercolors, I know they can get expensive. This is the brand that I'd recommend giving a try to. And these are the colors that we're going to be using today. I have a cadmium yellow, cadmium red, and ultramarine blue. You essentially just need a yellow, red, and blue, but those are the specific ones I'm going to be using because we will be doing some color mixing for the painting today, except for the black. For the cat, normally I would say you want to mix your blacks because it creates a richer black, but for watercolor in particular, I found that just using a straight black is your best bet if you want to put that color on the paper. Those are the brushes we're going to be using. The blue one's just a basic round brush, whatever you want. It's just a mixing brush because you don't want to mix with your good watercolor brush. If you are serious about getting into watercolors, I do really recommend spending more on your watercolor brush. It will make it a lot easier. They're just designed to hold the water better and glide on the paper. But the nice thing is that I'm going to show you, you can do small lines as well as really big lines with just that one simple round brush. And so this is the sketch that I did preemptive to this drawing, and that's highly what I recommend doing before you tackle this, is practicing your sketching skills. Plan out your painting before you actually go forward and do it. It's fun to be spontaneous, but when you're going for a certain outcome, planning really will help you in the long run. So I think sometimes people get dismayed because they can't do it from the get-go. It just takes a little bit of preparation. So sit down, sketch something out a couple of times. You can follow along and just do the cat, which is what I'm showing you today, or pick any other spooky Halloween shape. You could maybe do a bat or a pumpkin, a spider. It's whatever you think that you want to do. As you can see today though, the techniques that we're going to be practicing are making circles and keeping the line between those two sections where the cat is, but just trying to create some depth with watercolor, which I know can be a struggle. I'm still learning myself, but I think this is going to be a really fun painting for us to do. So getting on to it, I was holding this pencil up before, but I didn't actually talk about this. This is a woodless watercolor pencil. It's what I recommend doing the sketch with. I didn't show you the whole sketching process because it's really hard to see. That's how lightly you want to draw on your watercolor paper. And that's because what we can do then is take water to it. And I found with the watercolor pencils, if you sketch and then you can kind of blend out your color to create a soft silhouette of what you're going to work on. And after you've taken the water to it like this, putting other colors on top of it, putting more water on top of it will not reactivate the watercolor as long as you let it dry first. And for me, that's been the biggest advantage of using them, because sometimes when you take water to watercolors, they tend to reactivate when you add water, and it can cause some bleeding issues. But I'm just going over my sketch, whatever you end up sketching out. I'm going over it with just water and my brush very gently, and you can move the pigment around a little bit after it's been activated, pushing a line out or pulling it in. I would just kind of blend it and make sure you bring it into the center as well, just to fully blend that color out. The nice thing is that this is a great practice piece because we're doing a black silhouette, which means even if you got a little more color on the paper than what you wanted, we're putting a really dark pigment over top of it. So we're going to be covering up a lot of this, and that's why I would choose a light color to sketch with, maybe a yellow. I used a brown here, and again, just super light, and you get kind of this sepia shadow on the paper itself that we'll be working with. There you go. Next step, let it completely dry before you come back to the painting. We're taking our mixing brush and we're going to mix all the colors for this painting today. So I'm taking ultramarine, dipping it into my red and just mixing it together. And I'm just going to go back and forth tinting them until I get the purple that I want. Don't worry too much about getting the tints themselves dirty. You can always wipe on your brush on a napkin like you see me have in my hand there, but generally you can also pick that pigment up really easily again with the brush, so you don't have to be too careful with your watercolor tins. We're going to make the orange, and that's just the red and the yellow. And I know this may seem really basic, just kind of going back to you know, in school mixing colors, if you had the opportunity to do that as you kind of learned what colors make what, but I think it's always good to get back to the basics. And I think it's important to understanding how to work with your colors on the page by just remembering how to blend them rather than buying them in a tube. So I think it's really great because you don't have to have a lot of watercolors to do this. As long as we have the 3 primaries, we can make just about any color that we want. And there we go. I recommend when you're painting having a spare piece of watercolor paper to do as I've just done there, to make myself essentially little swatches to the side. And that just kind of is good because you don't have to put it directly on your paper. And as you can see, the watercolor on the paper is going to look very different than your watercolor in the tin. So that's why swatches with watercolor as a medium itself are pretty important to plan out your desired effects, and that's just what I'm doing now. I'm referencing the original image, but as you can see, I'm not doing exactly what I did the first time. So this second image that we're doing, as you follow along with me here, is going to look a little different. We'll compare them at the end, and definitely let me know which one you like more. But the techniques that we are practicing here are still the same, and I think it's still going to look really fun at the end of the painting. I'm using plenty of water that I've had been carrying in the bristles of the brush, so it's very wet, and I'm putting the purple on the page. As far as how dark or how light it goes when you're dealing with watercolor, the amount of water that you're using matters, not just for spreading the pigment around, but for how concentrated that pigment is. I'm just going around the whole picture and placing circles just visually wherever I think they look good. In general, what I'm trying to keep in mind is how I want the eye to move across the page. So my preference and what I was going for with this painting was to put some dark colors in the corner and accentuate the cat with them, and moving towards the light, kind of how I would visualize a night sky, maybe as the setting sun or those dark purples, and then a really bright moon coming from overhead is the overall goal. And that's just these may just sound like kind of, you know, just random thoughts, but they are things to think about while you're painting and just to kind of keep in mind. It'll make it a lot easier to plan out your own designs. I'm being really careful not to touch these colors to each other. A watercolor technique is wet on wet, and that's where colors bleed into each other. That's what I don't want to happen here in this painting right now. What I'm actually wanting is just a wet on dry, so it's where the watercolor itself is wet and I'm putting it onto dry paper, opposing to wet paper, which we will be using wet on wet later in the painting. But right now I want my circles to be sharp and I want the edges to be really clear, so that's why I'm being careful not to let them bleed into each other at all. And in between, I'm rinsing out my brush. If you want to keep your water from getting too dirty too quickly, you can still wipe the pigment gently on a paper towel and then rinse your brush out. And that's a good way that if you don't have access to be able to change your water out too readily, like if you're outside painting, then that's a good thing to keep in mind, because you don't always want to put all the pigment on there. If it's too wet and you have like a big blob on the paper, then you may want to pull that up. You can dry off your brush, kind of get some of the water out of it, come back to it and very gently lift that pigment back up off the paper. Because if it's too wet on there, it can just dry and have kind of a weird funny texture. And what I'm going for with the bubbles is a very smooth texture versus the cat. When we get into the black, I'm going to let the water move around and create that kind of like fuzzy fur texture, which I personally just think is really interesting. And over in the corner here, I'm still using that orange that I was just using to make those really opaque little circles. I'm using it up here, just extremely watered down. And the contrast between having the darker colors and really light colors is what I think creates some depth in the painting and is just visually very interesting. And because I'm using a light color now, I'm going over this, so letting it dry in between each layer. I put in all my really dark colors. Now I'm coming in with light colors, and before I started that, I made sure that the previous layer was dry. If you're doing small ones and not using too much water, they may dry while you work on one section, work your way around the paper to another section, but unless you take a hairdryer to it, which you definitely can to speed up the process, or you can go ahead and just walk away for a little bit, which is kind of nice. We don't always have time to sit down and do a full painting all in one. Another good reason for watercolors being the fun medium that they are. It works really well to let layers dry and walk away and come back just when you have your next section, which is, again, a good reason to plan it out beforehand. So I've been enjoying watercolors recently. I wonder why. But they're really good. And we're just gonna keep doing this. I'm just kind of giving you time to follow along with me to plan out your painting. And so you can see I just kind of assess the painting each time before I come to it and just place that circle somewhere, a nice swoop. You can see it's hard not to do the little ones from your wrist, which means I have to be careful kind of almost sketching them in. When I do the big circles, you really want that motion to come fully from the elbow, and that's what makes it so easy to get a smoother circle, is movement from the elbow, not the wrist. But I don't know if there's a good way to do these teeny circles with the movement from the elbow. I have not mastered it yet, so I'm just with the wrist. And as you can see, I'm able to create these really small circles with just this one brush, as well as these really big circles. And that's because this is a really good brush. Like I said, watercolor artists, I think, all kind of have their preference on whether or not they think the paper, the paint, or the brush is the most important part. If you're going to like buy one nice thing for yourself for art, which one do you spend more money on and where do you cut the budget? Personally, for me, I think the brush was the biggest game changer. It made my watercolors behave absolutely differently because water control just seemed easier, and it seemed like the medium suddenly made a lot more sense. But because of that, and because spending more on the brush, like I said, I use this one brush pretty much all the time for almost any size, anything that I'm doing on watercolor paper. I only need the one brush, and that's also why I'm thinking that it makes a really great investment. I'm not as big on the paints. You can definitely, I think, do more budget-friendly watercolor paints, but I would get at least a step up from the little tins that you use in a can as like a kid, because they're not going to behave this way. But you can definitely cut the budget, I think, a little more there. And then watercolor paper probably in the middle. For me, it's definitely something that's extremely nice to paint on. The one I'm painting on right now is fairly heavy watercolor paper, and that means that it can handle a lot of water that I'm putting on the page. I'm being very liberal with my water, and you're seeing that it's soaking it right up and it's not running all over the place, and that's because I am using a pretty heavy watercolor paper, as well as this is cold pressed watercolor paper. And cold pressed means that it's going to have that texture. When you see hot pressed watercolor paper, it's going to have a very smooth texture, and all of it comes down to your preference just on what you enjoy. So again, when you don't know which one you like, I could buy budget there. And then once you kind of start leaning towards one, maybe think about getting nicer watercolor paper just to treat yourself. And it's definitely worth it. We are painting in the cat now. I've let all those previous layers dry. Like I've said before, we're kind of letting them dry between any layer that's touching. And I'm going in with a lot of water and just using the black straight from its little tin and painting in the cat. I'm able to cover up pretty much all of those colors that are underneath him, but I am letting the pigment kind of play around in the water. Again, it's very wet, and that's allowing me to push the pigment around on the paper and create these textures where an area is starting to dry and push the pigment back towards it, pushing it out towards new areas. I personally think it's a really fun effect. You have to decide for yourself what you like. That's something else you can just play with, but I'm not doing anything tricky. We're not going to sit here and put in all of the fur. That's kind of a whole separate video. This is just supposed to be fun and relaxing. So create cool textures. As I get up to the hat, something I am paying attention to, because I still want the definition between the two of them, but I don't want to have to go back in and paint over it, is I'm just pushing the color up towards the hat, and now I'm kind of playing around in the bottom, creating more texture, because I want that part to dry before I wet the new area. I don't want them to bleed into each other. I want to create that hard line. And so that's why if you let it dry first, you can do that. If you don't let it dry, unfortunately what's going to happen is you're going to cause just a little bit of a bleed, which again, it's okay if that happens. Play with the texture and lean into it. And you can always try again. This is already my second time painting this cat. And then we're going to compare them at the end. And I actually like elements from both of the pictures. So who knows, maybe I'll even paint him a third time. But that is what's fun about finding a medium that you love and playing around with it, is that there's always something you can learn from it and do. And you can always try to do it better. It doesn't have to be perfect on the first iteration of your painting. And if that's what's keeping you from doing your painting, just take a deep breath and go ahead and get some paper dirty. Just dirty up some paper, which is really all we're doing when we're painting. You see how dark that hat is. I used less water on the hat, a lot of black, and just really filled it in. And I'm just going back through and defining some areas to create a little more depth. I didn't listen to my own advice. There's actually a little bit of feathering, I think you can see, going on there. And that's okay. It's still interesting, but that is a good example of what I was trying to not do. And I got in a hurry and I thought, I'm just going to go ahead and paint these little sections. And that's what happened because it wasn't dry yet. So if you are in a hurry, again, hair dryer, just take a hair dryer to it, dry it. If you do that on an area that's really wet with a lot of pigment, I will tell you, you're going to get that texture that is on the cat in the middle. You'll get that feathering. I personally like it for the cat in this picture, and that's just because I had a lot of water and paint. But if you're trying to avoid that texture, then be really careful taking a hair dryer to an area like that that's really saturated. You could put it out in the sunshine if you got sun where you are, and that would speed up the drying process, which is why watercolor is a really great technique to take outside on the go, because being outdoors definitely helps it dry quicker. All right, now here we are coming in with a lot of water, just a little bit of pigment after everything else is dried, and I'm putting in just a little bit of a background. Normally I would say you don't want to kill your whites or your negative space, because that can really add pop to a picture, but as I was looking at it, I personally really like to have a background around the edges because I like seeing that bright white border when I pulled the tape off. So I personally always like to kind of define the edges of my picture, which is where I normally consider, how do I want to bring in this background? But you do not have to do this step. You also don't have to bring it into all of the edges. What I love about it is that it is a little bit just easy and fun to throw water down on the paper. If it's a really heavy watercolor paper, the pigment will stay only where you put water, so it's just like tracing an outline. And then you kind of drop some pigment in there and use your brush just to push it around. And then when it dries, normally it's soft and I think really fun. Taking off the tape, and this is again after it has fully dried. So watercolor, kind of like a cat, will love it as long as you leave it mostly alone and let it do its own thing. Here are the two watercolor paintings side by side. I really love the cat on the second picture, and I love the dark little dots and circles that are on there, but I like the big circles on the first one better. So I don't know, it's really hard to choose which one I like more. But that's another reason to do it more than once, because you're always practicing, you can always get better, and sometimes you explore things that you really like, and other times you realize that's something that you don't really care for how it worked out. Anyway, this was really fun. I hope you have a happy Halloween, and I will see you again next video. All right, bye.